Do you want to be an entrepreneur? Do you want to be a researcher? Or do you want to be an entrepreneurial researcher? For the university side of the house, there's an understanding around, well, what is the role and purpose of spin-outs? How do spin-outs add value? They provide opportunities for researchers and students. How does it, as another source of potential income for follow-on research and royalties from licensing and from equity positions? And thinking about the impact that can be delivered from research in terms of realising outcomes from the research itself, which is a hot button issue we all know about at the moment because commercialisation is currently in review at the federal level with the Department of Education under Minister Tudge. So there's some unique, particularly for the community on the webinar today, is to think about it from that perspective of where you sit as a researcher and looking at it from a university. And to recognise that a spin out is a big step. So today, the reason why we actually have myself presenting and Richard presenting is that my perspective, I will come from the perspective of a university. I'll look at the challenges associated with the university and what it's looking for. And that, whether you're a researcher or you're a professional working in the university with responsibility for commercialisation, translation activities, understanding that as a challenge. Okay. Also, and then Richard will look at it from the perspective of, as an external investor, if you're going to establish a spin out, what do you need to know about building a successful spin out that's an investable proposition and working with partners outside of the university? And what do they see when they look in? Okay. Here are the two dimensions that we'll try to bring today. On a previous webinar, we looked at the basics around IP and commercialisation. And we have this general life cycle that we talk through. So you start with your research and then you move into IP-focused activities where you're looking to identify that IP, assess it, and then apply some protections around it. And if it has commercial value, then what is the commercialisation focus that you want to use to actually deliver impact? And there's a plan, an execute, and a managed stage of that life cycle. When we move into that latter stage through the commercialisation, by how we go through that process of realising value from research, there's a strategy and governance framework that needs to sit over the top of that. And there are generally three different approaches that you can think about that apply to commercialisation or translation of research outcomes for impact. They can be licensing, they can be venture-based, or they can even be across these elements, those three elements, and on a mix and match basis. And the best approach in each opportunity is always going to be on a case-by-case basis. The key element around that is that no commercialisation activity is exactly the same as the last one. Okay? Each one has its own nuance, it has its own challenges because of the nature of the research itself and the focus in terms of societal benefit. Today we're looking at that ventures channel, and specifically we're looking at spin-outs, and we'll go a little bit more into what do we define a spin-out as opposed to, which is in this particular instance where we contextualize that is a university-led startup. Richard will uncover those a little bit more in terms of articulating generally around general startups. But in this particular vein, we are looking at it as a university-led startup. You can look at them as partnerships or joint ventures. For spin-outs, we position these as primarily researcher-led ventures. The researchers take the lead. And then you've got other aspects around whether an external party leads the startup, partnerships and joint ventures, those other aspects. But for today, when we look at spin-outs, we're looking at spin-outs primarily as a researcher-led venture. And those ventures can be for purpose and or for profit. You can raise those funds, so ventures, they can raise funds from university and or investors, and they can leverage other grants and other sources of projects and in the innovation funding that's available out there in the sector. You may engage the university for incubation and research support as part of your activity. But the key thing in all of that, when we look at the venture stream in particular, the ventures are actually really hard work. They require a long time, they're a long-term effort, they're highest risk, but they also deliver the greatest reward. We're now going to we'll hand over to Richard. Richard's going to just introduce us to the concepts around contextualising startups and university spin-outs, and then a little bit more around what it actually takes to establish a successful spin-out. Richard.
Thanks, Ken. So over the last couple of years, everyone's been very interested in startups. Everyone's been talking about them. We recently had a Prime Minister not so long ago who said there's never been a better time to, launch your startup and be a founder. And that's true. There's more money and more help available today than there's ever been for startups. Most startups look like the left-hand panel on the slide that you can see on your screen now. Let's call it a normal startup. And a normal startup usually begins life with the founders having identified a problem that they believe represents a large market, and they develop a solution for that problem. They normally work on this either in their spare time, or they work 24/7 if they're able to pay their way somehow, or if they're able to raise money. But the key point, founders are doing all of the work, and it's a very lonely existence as a founder of a normal startup until such time as you have enough money to be able to start hiring people and hiring a team around you. You're pretty much doing this on your own. And another thing about most startups is that most of them are what we would call, they're concerned with commercializing a new type of business model. And the thing about business models is that they're easily copied. So it becomes a case of who can run the fastest, who can win the race, who can scale up the fastest. So that's what a normal startup looks like. Now, university spin-outs are also startups, but they're different. They often begin life as a solution in search of a problem to solve, and a problem to solve that's actually representative of a market that's large enough to be commercially interesting. The founders are usually the researchers, but the researchers often have a foot in both camps, in the university and also in the spin-out, at least for a period of time. The spin-outs need to be independent of the university, but that doesn't mean that they cannot be a partner of the university and to leverage the university's community and resources, and vice versa, for the university to benefit from what the spin-out's doing. And lastly, all university spin-outs are usually based around some level of intellectual property, which is based on years of research. And that's a strategic asset, and hopefully provides a competitive advantage and enables something that's better than what's currently available outside. But university spin-outs are still startups. They face all the usual risks that startups face, including reality proving to be different to what you thought, things taking longer, things not working, customers being fickle and not loving your product, and perpetually running out of money. So let's talk about some key success factors for spin-outs. I could have a very long list here. I've chosen just to focus on 4 things. First of all, as with any startup, a spin-out needs to have a sound strategy. This isn't about the research. It's not about the IP. It's about a commercialization strategy for building a successful business, because spin-outs need to be a business, and they need to have a business model that makes sense. The thought process and the work involved in coming up with a sound strategy is not trivial, and the first version of it is probably not the version you end up going with. You might have to iterate this many times to get it right. But having a sound strategy is fundamentally important. As important for a university spin-out is you need to have the permission and support of the university for what it is you want to do. Getting this permission and support, in my experience so far as an external person having to deal with universities on the inside now, this can be actually one of the biggest challenges. And it's about getting alignment with goals and the key performance indicators that matter to the university and also to the academics within the university. It's about having a shared vision for what the spin-out is going to be doing and why that is of interest and benefit to the university, and so on. And we'll talk more about these things later. It's very important, the third point on this slide, to have a team that actually wants to do this. Spin-outs don't spin out by themselves. They need people. And the people need to be prepared to commit to drive the venture. And this is the big decision for researchers who want to do a spin-out. Do I want to do this? Am I prepared to make the commitment? Am I prepared to give up certain things and take some risk? This is a major, major decision. And lastly, the spin-out will need funding, at least enough to get started, and it can raise more later commercially, but it needs some funding, otherwise you can't do anything. So those are the four basic fundamental key success factors. So let me talk about the first of those in a bit more detail. I said a sound strategy was fundamentally important. So what do I mean by a strategy? Well, there's at least three fundamental pillars of a good strategy. The first one is whatever it is you are planning to do, it needs to be planned around a customer. And a good strategy is one which is planning around a type of customer of which there are many, so that you have a big enough market to create a commercially interesting and viable opportunity. The second thing is for those customers, that stereotype, that target, are you going to be giving them or offering them a compelling value proposition, something that they really want? This could be because it's something new that they couldn't do before. It could be because it's a significant improvement on what they currently do. And I stress it has to be significantly better, because if it's only incrementally better, no one cares. And lastly, as the third pillar, you need to have a viable business case. And the ingredients for a viable business case are really the first two things I've just mentioned: a large enough market and having a compelling value proposition that's going to mean that enough of those customers will want to deal with you. It's also about ensuring that the path to market, the path to those commercialization pathways, the time they take, the money they're going to take, that those things are viable. I mean, it would be wonderful if you were the university spin-out that was going to commercialize cold fusion. Good luck to you. But the pathway for doing that and the money involved is so enormous, you're probably going to struggle unless you have significant resources and very large partners. So every spin-out needs to have a viable business case and business plan for moving forward. Ken, thank you. Next, I said you needed the university's support. So think of the university as a stakeholder. They want to know, or would like to be shown, why spin-out is the right pathway for the research that the spin-out would be using. Perhaps there are alternative pathways, and why is spin-out the most appropriate? It's also going to help if the spin-out and what the spin-out is trying to do is actually going to be supporting the goals of the university and aligning with them. And what are you asking for from the university? This is the quid pro quo. You're asking, obviously, for the right to use the IP that the research is wrapped up in, and which, under your conditions of employment, there'll be certain policies around how IP has to be managed. You may be asking them to support you. You may be asking for cash. We'll talk later about how these things can be weighed up to see whether there's a good deal here for the university and for the spin-out. And at the end of the day, the university has many ways that they can benefit from spin-outs. The money that the spin-out may generate is one source of value, but there are other sources of value too, such as career paths for researchers, attracting students, building reputation, attracting partners, creating a sense of excitement. There are many things that spin-outs can do for a university above and beyond the simple metric of how much money is the spin-out going to make for the university. And we'll talk more about those as we go through more of this presentation today. Now, this third area, the team. As I said earlier, a spin-out doesn't spin out by itself. It needs a team. And this is probably the biggest challenge because it means someone, it could just be one person, but maybe it's a couple of them. Someone needs to essentially change what they're doing and change their career. Spinning out without a founder is very hard to do because you have to go and find someone who wants to do this thing about which they have at the outset, they have no passion for it, they have no involvement with it. The best founders are the ones that are actually involved and have been involved with the essence of the spin-out, in this case, the research. But not every researcher can be or should be a founder of a spin-out. So it really is a difficult challenge to find researchers who both want to do it and have the right capabilities to do it. And so one of the interesting questions is how you can create a spin-out with a team where you have the necessary capabilities and also a sensible pathway for the researchers who want to be involved, but perhaps not involved in a full-time capacity. If the spin-out's to raise money, the team will be the thing that investors are going to look at. And the team needs to be seen to be committed. Otherwise, the spin-out's going to have great difficulty in raising money. But I would say, if you want to do a spin-out, as I said earlier, there's never been a better time. There's so much more money available today. There's so much more help available today. So many more mentors and lessons learned today that it's never been easier. It's not easy, but it's never been easier. So if you want to do it, there are people who can help you. It goes without saying that you need money as well. And you can come from many different places. Perhaps the university will, in addition to giving you a license to use the IP, perhaps the university can also kick in some cash. Usually, though, you're going to turn to investors, outsiders. And for them, what I spoke about before when I was speaking about the fundamentals, the KSFs, the strategy, the team, that's what the investors will be looking at. There are also grants that you can use. There are some commercialization grants available. They usually require matching funding, so you have to get investors to provide the matching funding. A spin-out company has the advantage of being able to also use R&D tax rebates. So that's something the university can't do, but the spin-outs can. And lastly, but most importantly, customers. Customers are a really good source of funding. If you can sell something to a customer, they give you money, and you can use that money to keep running and sell again. So having customers or identify who your customers could be and be able to sooner rather than later sell something to them is a great way of funding your spin out. And to get money, of course, the spin out itself has to be investable. And there are certain things that make a spin out investable and certain things that can make it quite toxic to investors. It's also very important that the structure of the spin out is fair for the founders, because they're going to be taking risk and they need to make sure there needs to be enough in it for them for the long journey ahead to make it worthwhile. And this is where the universities have to be careful. Universities have to be careful not to impose uncommercial conditions on their spin outs, because that will doom the spin out to failure from day one. So there are some parameters in which universities can structure deals for spin outs, which makes sense. Going outside of those parameters is going to mean a lot of problems. So having sensible policies, having a commercial mindset, recognising that the university is both a beneficiary but also a stakeholder, is the right way to think about the commercial terms around a spin out to make it fundable. So some basic rules around some of those commercial terms I was talking about. Universities should not be majority investors in spin-outs. They should have a minority stake. And when I talk about a minority stake, what I mean there is the stake the university has after the initial investment. So just to be clear. And this is because having a university in control of a spin-out causes all sorts of problems. It leads to, it deters investors. It makes the university actually accountable for the spin-out, so it's a risk for the university. It also means it's probably going to be ineligible for various grants and tax concessions. And another effect of the universities being controlled spin-outs is that it doesn't leave enough equity on the table for the founders or for investors. And so the investors won't come and the founders get demotivated. So when structuring a spin-out deal, it's very important to get the balance right between what the university needs, what the founders need, and what the investors will find reasonable and commercial. Last year, we were involved in some, very early in Campus Plus's life last year, we were involved in some spin-out projects. And we kept on being asked the question, what are other universities doing? What are the benchmarks? Are there some standards and policies and practices we can copy or align ourselves to? So we did a survey to find out, because we had our own ideas, but we thought we'd better cast the net a bit wider. So we did a survey, and the survey findings we actually published last year as well. But there were some key headlines. We found a lot of things that we expected to find. We found that most universities had some experience of spin-outs, some more than others. Mostly positive experiences. We knew and we found that the university's equity positions in spin-outs were all over the place. There was no particular model there. On average, the founders seem to have around half the equity. That would obviously be very early in the spin-out's life, so immediately after first investment, or around, but not too much later on, because later on the founders will be diluted by subsequent rounds of investment. So immediately after the initial investment, around 50% equity. We also found that the university generally wanted to have a research relationship with the spin-outs. So those are the things we expected to find. Some of the things we found, not so surprising, but important to note, is that translation funding, the money that is available to take research from research to a commercially investable proposition, that money, translation funding as it's called, that wasn't always available. And we see this as a major gap. It's the money that's used to prove up the business case, which then allows a spin out and investors and so on to happen. That money isn't widely available. We also found that a lot of the universities didn't actually have a particular policy or strategy around how they wanted to do spin-outs. The spin-outs that had happened for them were probably one-offs. They were designed specifically for a situation without any particular policy or strategy to guide that process, which probably means it took a long time with a lot of going around in circles and probably not very efficient. We also found that most spin-outs were in fact researcher-led, hence the focus of today's webinar, and that most universities, whether they do so or not, they would all like to try to support the spin-outs, to incubate them in some sense, to provide a bit of a mothership for the spin-outs in its early days. So there's a mixture there of surprises and good intentions, but also in those cases in that right-hand panel, a lack of maybe capability and experience.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.
Richard's just covered over some key elements around the spin-out itself and what it needs to be successful. What we'll now look at is some of the strategy and governance elements around what a university needs to have in place to put a process for spin-outs to be successful. And there are 8 general areas that we think are important to address. So from that previous slide, we talked about there was over half the universities didn't have a policy, a strategy for spin-outs, and over half did not even have a strategy for how they would deal with spin-outs. So it wasn't even a strategic level of thinking around that. So we'll look at those elements around strategy and policy, governance, engagement and control, how the university realises impact and returns, how it thinks about researcher employment and transition from research domain to spin-out, research, translation, ongoing engagement, so how you actually do the translation of research, the execution of that, and then supporting that ongoing engagement to drive further research opportunities as a role of the university, what the university might want to think about in terms of funding, the support that it might provide for that incubation through those early stages for the university, and then finally talking about equity and IP balances. So Richard gave an intimation that there's some further, he's going to talk specifically around some of the aspects around getting the balance right around equity and IP. So when we look at strategy and policy and setting the objective, there's a couple of key questions. So first of all, is there an IP and or a commercialisation policy that covers how and why a spin-out might occur? Okay. Is there a correlation between the university's strategy in terms of how it describes delivering research impact and translation, and then how that's communicated down through policy and procedures in terms of what it's trying to do? That sets a common basis for aligning those objectives for commercialisation and a reference against which the university can make decisions around specific cases for spin-outs. And that the policy then sets out the how and why and those general rules around how that's going to work. And that there's interoperability not only between that IP policy, commercialisation policies, but it also interoperates with the rest of the university's policies around commercial entities, commercial activities, how it might support employment, how it engages with other parties as into commercial operations, but also research and research engagement, research agreements. So there's a number of things that come together there around those elements, how it deals with its operations as a university. And they set that common basis for aligning the objectives for commercialisation and use that as your reference for going forward. Once you've got that strategy and policy element around that, then there's the control, so the governance, engagement, and managing that actual activity of that commercialisation. So the question then comes into the university: which organisation manages your commercialisation activity? So in that respect, if I'm a researcher, where am I going to talk to somebody about, I want to do a spin out? Who's the authority in the university to guide me through that process, who can help make decisions on behalf of the university and advise me if I'm setting up a spin out, what I need to be conscious of and what the university will do and how that relationship works. Okay? And there's a key point in the distinction between governance, management, control, the university representative. What does the university do, all right, versus how it manages employees representing in executive management and governance roles. So if you're a university employee and you're working as part of that, what is the role of the university in terms of supporting you to do that, if you're in a governance role or in that transition piece? There's some challenges around that, whether or not you introduce challenges for shadow directorships and a few other bits and pieces around controlling organisations and how that happens, okay? But make sure you understand clearly who makes those decisions, what part of the university controls that engagement for research, IP, equity, funding and support for and with spin-outs, and who manages the portfolio of whatever the university's interests are in spin-outs and commercialisation generally. Also for the university, how does it think about impact and returns? There are going to be challenges here based on who controls that research capability, but the key thing is how do you actually manage beneficial outcomes back to the university as a result of commercialisation through a spin-out? And that not only just a spin out, but that things more broadly, it's tied in more broadly for how the university deals with recognising impact and value and returns from IP. Okay, and there's three distinct elements there around equity, the royalties from the licensing activity, and then research income. Okay, research income, the herd C, managed and counted differently, not necessarily beneficial return, but can actually drive particular behaviours and considerations around who makes decisions around how that research engagement happens. Equity and royalties are beneficial returns, and you need a standard, consistent model up front to define how those beneficial returns to the university for commercialisation of IP are managed, and at the time that they are realised, have you established a basis for those at the initial outset for that particular project, for that as the basis for those returns to be managed. Make those decisions early on under a framework, but make those decisions early on around how that's going to be managed. There are going to be some indirect softer impacts through reputation, ongoing relationships and development, and these can be important for a university to be able to pick up and tell the story around how it's delivering impact. And what's the role of the spin-out and the researchers in supporting that? What does the university expect or want to achieve from that? And who's managing and measuring those to the university? So we know that we can measure equity returns, we can measure royalty returns. If you look at some of the broader reputational aspects, who's responsible for managing and measuring that realisation of that, and how's that measured? How are you communicating that? Another piece to look at is around that key challenge. And so Richard highlighted, if you've got a researcher who wants to be a founder and wants to go with a spin out, there's an aspect around that transition from researcher to founder. And how does that happen? And how do you think about what's the researcher's employment conditions and how does that change through the process of that translation or that transition period? What is the expectation of the researcher versus a foundation in terms of their time commitment to the role and what hat they're wearing at a particular point in time? So if they're in a meeting, who are they representing? And then you can manage their employment for impacted transitions, both as individuals and part as research teams, So in the organisations they work in, if they're now moving off into a spin out, what does that mean for the rest of the research team and the objectives of the research institute or group that's doing that work or related work and other opportunities? Think about how those individuals move from full-time to part-time, contractor, casual, whatever the engagement manager. And what support are you providing for entrepreneurial researchers through that journey? Either, and there are ways that you can think about this. Are you actually putting researchers into that business? They're still employees, and the business is paying for that researcher to participate in that business. How does that facilitate entrepreneurial researchers participating in spin-outs as well as part of your transition piece? When we look at research, translation, and ongoing engagement, the key, particularly around research management, is what's the strategy you're going to put in place for that initial translation and then the ongoing engagement? So what are the framework that you have in place for that? Clearly identifying what IP data assets and resources, and even the research relationships and agreements that transition, and then who's responsible for maintaining those elements once it's now done that transition and you're trying to drive that ongoing relationship. Put some structure around that, formalise it. Think about who gets to make decisions around research, the transition and the ongoing relationship with the spin out and with other parties who might be involved or related to that research domain. Funding. So Richard highlighted that funding's very, very important. We all know this. So the question is, how much will the university invest in commercialising or supporting a spin out? And when does that stop? When does it say, yes, we're prepared to commit that? So we mentioned before about the translation funding. This is where it fits into that space. If you think about it as a commercialisation planning activity, that activity might actually cost, might be a grant style investment made by the university of around about $50,000 to support that initial commercialisation activity. Equity investment post that might be a different conversation, or funding to support that next stage post that initial creation of that plan and say, yep, this is what we're going to do. What does the initial investment look like from a university? Is it capital? Is it support resources? Okay. And if it's funding, what are the sources of funds for those activities? Does the university have a dedicated funding source, or is it actually from consolidated sources? Okay. And a key tip, consider your internal and salaries and the budgets during that incubation period. So this is for a university. What additional investment is it making in terms of other parts of the university supporting that spin out? And how are you accounting for that and considering that in terms of the support and commitment that the university is going to make, not only in terms of time, but also there is a funding or a financial element of that as well. And the last point I'll talk to, second last point that we've got, but the last point I'll talk to is around incubation support. Building a spin out, it's hard. Building a spin out of deep tech, emerging tech from research is really hard. Okay. And universities are great environments to incubate spin outs. The question is what is the support that the university provides for that to occur? What is it committing to in terms of allowing those environments to, those spin outs to incubate and grow and transition and realise their potential? Okay. It can be heaps. You can do a lot. There might be some basic services that you provide around facilities and space and facilities. It could be a cluster type organisation. It might be an incubator that the university operates that it also supports the spin outs to go into on some reasonably attractive commercial terms that it can go in there at. Okay. It might provide access to IT. It might provide some technical support services as they look to take their technology from research lab environment to something that's a initial first run, initial production solution for the market and all the steps in between. Okay. And what can the university do in connecting, mentoring, and early stage business management connections? Where do these people find good business advice? So commercial, financial, legal support. Generally, that's the responsibility of the spin out to take care of that. But what role can the university play in pointing them in the right direction and providing those network relationships into the community that the university operates as part of it delivering its impact? Services can be delivered in collaboration with other parties. So you might actually have the university may direct other parties. They're the people you need to go and talk to, or it might actually be something that the university delivers through its incubator or accelerator programs, those things that it's put in place. Now, Richard's going to talk about this final point about equity and IP, a very, very difficult and challenging conversation, but getting it done early is always the best approach. Richard.
Thanks, Ken. The reason why this slide is where it is in the sequence is because really we're at the point where we have to weigh up different contributions and requirements going forward to come to a fair and practical deal. And I think it's really good to think about it, as the slide suggests, as a set of scales. You're weighing up the two sides. On the one side, you have the university and the weight it's putting on the scales, the value it's putting on the scales, the value of the IP in its current state. Now, remember, a lot of research is research. It's not actually a product. It's not something that can be used by anyone. It's research. So the question is, what is the value of the IP as is? How useful is it? How much more work is going to need to be done on it to make it actually useful? So that's one consideration. The other obvious piece of value the university is putting on the scales is what sort of rights is it going to give the spin out, the team and the people who invest in that company? What sort of rights is it going to give them to use that IP? The more rights they have, clearly the more value the university is contributing. What's been the level of the university's funding and support and contribution to date? There's usually a history here, and it begins as research in the normal course of research, but maybe there's been more specific support as well in the recent past. Maybe there's been some translation funding provided to prove up the value of the IP, to establish that there is a commercial business case. So that needs to be considered in the mix. And perhaps the university also wants to provide, or is going to offer to provide, support going forward, whether it's incubation support, the kind of things that Ken was talking about just a moment ago, or cash, or both. So on the left of the scales, the university could contribute different levels of value. And those different levels of value, as you would expect, should be reflected in the university's share of equity in the spin-out. And on the scales there, you'll see I've got some tilt angles on there. And those numbers aren't made up, they're real numbers. So the average equity in university spin-outs post initial investment is around 20%, and that's based on a large sample both in Australia and in the UK. And the range is anywhere from 0 to 40%. Typically, there are obviously going to be exceptions to that, but that's the range, and the average is very much around 20. So, of course, every percent of equity the university has is 1% less of equity available for the founders, the researchers and the investors in that spin-out. So the university is contributing all that value on the left. Now let's have a look at what's being asked for or required of the people on the right. The people on the right being the researchers, the founders, and the investors who back the spin-out team. So what are they contributing? What value are they adding? What commitments are they making? And a lot of this is about what the researchers are prepared to do. So the more commitment the researchers are prepared to make, the more equity they should have. The more the more risk and secure and sacrifice they're potentially making, the more equity they should have, and vice versa. So it's about finding the happy medium there. But remember, if you're going to be a founder of a spin-out, it's a long road, it's years. And along the way, your equity is going to be diluted. So it's very important, both for the founders and also for the investors who are backing the founders to make the spin-out a success. It's very important that the founders have sufficient equity at the beginning so that at the end, hopefully, if things go well, they'll have enough equity in the business to be meaningful and to compensate for those years of effort and years of risk. But also, on that right-hand side, the other people are being asked to make a contribution and take risk are the investors, the people who are going to fund the spin-out in its early, most risky period. The spin-out is going to need a certain amount of money, and that certain amount of money, depending on how much money is required, is going to have a price tag attached to it called valuation or percent of equity required to make that commercial. So you can't have a spin-out which needs lots of money and has a very high valuation because you're not at that stage yet. The valuation has to be commercially realistic, otherwise you'll never get the investors to invest. So that puts some constraints around how much equity the university can expect to have, because there's got to be enough equity left in the deal for the investors to fund it. A very important point here, though, is that I had the university on the left of the scales here. But let's remember, the university is also a stakeholder in a spin-out. So they stand to benefit as well. So they will benefit from the contributions and commitments and risks taken by the researchers and by the investors. And that benefit will come to the university in the form of a range of different things, both tangible and intangible. The tangible stuff is going to be income. So the university may get income through license royalties. They may get income through contract research that the spin-out comes back to the university for. They may get other benefits, intangible benefits like prestige, reputation, creating an exciting environment for researchers and students, which leads to talent attraction, attracting new types of industry partners, new types of sponsorships. There can be all kinds of intangible benefits that the university needs to weigh up in its equation when it's thinking about how much do I want to negotiate for in this deal as my equity position as a university. So the university, unlike everyone else, the university has a stake in both sides of these scales, whereas the researchers and investors are on one side. So the university has more to play with, has more degrees of freedom, and the university needs to have sensible policies and practices around how it comes to settle on a fair and practical deal for a spin-out venture.
There we go. Thanks, Richard. So that brings us pretty much to the end of our session, other than to wrap it up and just say that the key thing that I hope we've highlighted for you today, that the successful process for spin-outs, you need a strategy, you need some rules, okay? And that strategy is not only for the researcher in their approach to setting up a business and thinking about a business strategy, but more holistically for a university in terms of its strategy and its approach to commercialisation through ventures and through researcher-led spin-outs in particular. Okay? There's an understanding there that the support by the university should have clear approval and alignment. You need clear rules around how that's going to happen. Okay, and that needs to be well understood by the appropriate people in the university and by the researchers and the investors in that spin-out. Researchers who are going to be spin-out founders need to be motivated, all right? They've got to be motivated because they're the people who are going to drive the venture, particularly through its early stages, to set the foundations for success for moving forward. And of course, I think we've hit it a couple of times through the whole conversation, and that comes to funding. Some of which the university may provide it as an investment, but for researchers who are founders of spin-outs, you need to think about where that funding source comes from. Universities need to be conscious of it if they're going to put an investment in, because part of it is how are they going to actually realise impact and benefit or returns from those spin-out opportunities that it supports. Okay. So thanks, everyone. We'll just drop into some questions and answers. Zoe, I take it we've got a few questions online at the moment.
Yes, we have. So the first one was from Karu SL. Can patents be jointly owned by a company and the university?
I'll have to get some clarification, but my understanding is that no. All right. So the ownership who's listed on the patent can be generally individuals, but if you're going to provide, if somebody's going to commercialise a patent, you need to give them the capacity to commercially exploit it to its fullest potential. Okay.
Yeah. Could I just add to that? From a investability point of view, very bad idea. Don't do it. Give the spin out a clear license to use the IP and with an assignment option. Otherwise, your spin out won't get funded.
Okay, Richard, this next one's for you. This was relating to fairly early on in the presentation. How do you deal with conflicts of interest in the case where you've got a researcher with a foot in both camps? So still part of the university, but also part of a spin out.
Sure. Yeah, I have some recent experience of that. I think it comes down to, you'll remember earlier in this presentation, we spoke a lot about alignment. Was there good alignment between the university and the spin-out in terms of what the spin-out was trying to do and why it was a good idea for the university to support the spin-out? I think if fundamentally you have alignment in the very beginning, there shouldn't be a conflict of interest that arises. And then I think in terms of governance type issues, clearly, if the researcher has got a foot in both camps, and let's say the spin out is wanting to contract some research to do a project to maybe take the technology further into another level, and in terms of contract, clearly the researcher is going to be involved in that research. But they shouldn't be negotiating a contract because that would be an obvious conflict of interest. So you'd have on the one hand someone else in the spin out, a commercial manager, probably the CEO, and for the university you'd have someone else in the university negotiating a contract for the university using normal university policies and terms. I think if you have alignment in the first place, conflicts shouldn't happen. And secondly, there are some governance areas where clearly you can just avoid conflicts with simple rules.
I'll just add to that too, Zoe. All universities will have a conflict of interest policy. If you're a researcher spinning out, the first thing you should be very aware of is what is driving you in terms of the decisions that you're making. If you're heading down this path, be upfront, declare a conflict of interest. And that's not only just for the researcher, but for those people who may benefit in some form or other. When I highlight the difference between who gets to make decisions about research engagement and those sorts of opportunities, that's what you're trying to avoid. You're trying to avoid people, inadvertently making the wrong decision or making a decision that then gets called into question later on. If you're upfront about understanding where your interests lie and declaring them, then you're in a good position to understand how to manage your conflicts. If you're not in a position to make a decision, make sure that you can identify somebody who can make that decision.
Thanks for that, Ken. A question here, is there merit in a university running its own internal incubator programs?
Short answer is yes.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm of the opinion that universities are a great place to incubate, spin out startups, new enterprises, predominantly from an environment, more from an environment perspective itself. Incubators serve as, I suppose, that point where you can move what the university does outside of the university and create those connections into the community. But you can also use it to, community can also then integrate into and feel connected into a university as a source of innovation, inspiration, great ideas and support.
I just add to all of that, an incubator is not a research department. So it needs to have a different set of KPIs. It needs to have a different set of expectations and a recognition that things will, at some point or another, it's either up or out because it's about incubation for commercial purpose, and you either leave and go on to bigger, better things, or you decide it's not working and shut it down.
It operates for it's driving a commercial outcome, or a commercially driven outcome is ideally what an incubator is trying to achieve.
Okay, here's another one. Should founder equity be vested up front?
Yes.
Maybe you just want to explain that, Richard.
Yeah. And this doesn't just relate to university spin-outs, it's all startups. It's a very good idea to have founder vesting. And there's two reasons for it. Reason number one is that if you're an investor in a startup or a spin-out, you're investing for the long term. It's going to be 7, 10, 15 years before you get a return on your investment. You want to know that the founders are committed to the long term and not just going to sit back and let other people do all the work and take all the risk. So one way of creating some alignment is to have vesting, where effectively the founders earn back their equity. Let's say the founders had at the beginning 40% of the equity, let's say. And over the next 4 years, that equity would vest in them at, say, 10% a year. There's going to be dilution along the way, but if you just talk about the initial equity percentages, at the end of the 4 years, they fully own the equity they started with. And it's just a way of ensuring that they're committed at least for a reasonable length of time and don't have any incentive to free ride. And the second point I make about founder vesting is that if you're in a team where there's a co-founder or co-founders, one of the other benefits of founder vesting is it protects you. If one of your colleagues slacks off and puts their feet up and decides to free ride, founder vesting is a way to protect you, because what will happen is their shares won't vest and yours will. So they don't get to free ride and they lose their equity.
Fantastic. Thanks for the explanation there, Richard. Well, I think we're pretty much at 1 o'clock. So thank you, everybody, for attending today. Thank you, Ken and Richard. Fantastic presentation. For everybody that registered today, the recording of the webinar will be available next week online. And I'll also email all of you the registration details for the next PD Plus session, which will be linked in. So that will be on Friday, the 20th of August. So in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great weekend wherever you are in the country, and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks.